Hey everybody, ScriptTactics here, and today I'm going to be going over how to install Wireguard on an Ubuntu 22.04 LTS server. This tutorial can be applied to any Ubuntu or Debian-based Linux operating system. This is going to be directly from my slides that I have linked in my on my GitHub page. I'll have that linked in the description down below. And this will be covering the virtual private server setup. So you can use these steps to set up a Wireguard VPN server in the cloud using something like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Linode, any type of service provider that will offer you a free or low usage or any type of usage virtual private server. So let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is apt update and apt upgrade the system just to make sure everything's up to date. Sudo apt upgrade. So this may take a while, so we'll come back once this is completed because this is a brand new install. Everything is finished, so now we're going to install Wireguard. So sudo apt install Wireguard. We're going to keep everything as is and hit enter. Okay, so now we have Wireguard installed. So now the first thing we're going to do is run the command umask 077. And this just sets the keys only accessible to the root user. And then we're going to use the Wireguard gen key command using the WG utility. We're going to pipe that and we're going to generate our private key. And then we're going to pipe that output into the WG utility again, this time running the pub key command, and generate our public key. So now if we type ls, you should see our private key and our public key. So now we're going to move those. So we're going to type sudo move etc Wireguard. That's going to be our directory, and we're going to say private key here. And we're going to do the same thing for the public key. So I'll actually just go back here. And public key. So now if we type ls, you should no longer see those there. So one thing really quick we're going to do before we actually go into some configuration is we're going to modify one file here. And there's syscontrol.conf. So in here, we're going to press Control W to search, and we're going to look for this line, net.ipv4.ip_forward equals, and there we go. So now we see that net.ipv4.ip_forward equals 1. So it says uncomment the next line to enable packet forwarding for IPv4. So we're just going to delete that line right there, Control X, and hit yes. So what we just did is, because we're running this on a server, we don't have more than one port, theoretically. Now you can create new virtual ports, you can create new interfaces, but in this case we're only using one interface, one port that's coming in and out of the server. So any information that comes in terminates at the one port. However, we're going to make this now forward traffic back out after it's come through. So that'll allow our Wireguard connections to come in, and then they get forwarded back out. So now we're going to just verify that our config changes went through. So we're going to type sudo syscontrol-p, and you should now see that this value has been saved. So now we're going to go and we're going to create our WG0 configuration. So we're going to do sudo nano /hc wireguard wg0.conf. So this file does not exist, so we're going to create it now and open up into it. So in here, first thing we're going to do is using 2 square brackets, and we're going to create an interface. So we're going to say private key is the first value here. We're also going to have a listen port. We're going to have an address. We're going to have save config, and then we're also going to have a peer. And in this peer, we're going to have a public key, and we're going to have an allowed IP section. So let's go and walk through what each value is going to be. So private key. So this value here in the interface will be the private key that we just generated. So we'll print that to the screen and we'll come back in here and we will paste it in. But we'll do that in a second. Listen port. So this value is going to be 51820. Now you could set this to whatever you want. By default, Wireguard uses 51820. This guide assumes that you're using 51820. So anytime you see a reference to 51820, if you do change your port, I recommend writing it down and then updating it to that new value that you set. So address here, we're going to put, in my case, I'm going to do 10.0.0.1/24. So this could be any value within the RFC 1918 range. And what this specifies is any internal IP address. So you can even make this another range as well using the comma here. So 168.0.1/24, 192.168.10.1/24. You can create whatever value you want, but in my case, I'm only doing the 10.0.0.1 subnet. And so if you want to learn more about that, I recommend looking at the RFC 1918 information, looking at the description for that specification there, and then you can set up your config however you want there. And save config, we're going to set to true. So what this does is basically anytime we bring up the Wireguard interface and anytime changes were made to this WG0 config, they will get saved. So when it gets brought back up, we'll also have those values saved in there, because this basically gets torn down every time we reboot the server. So we're going to put one more thing in here, and this will be the allowed IP. So we're going to do 10.0.0.2/32. And so what this is saying is for this specific peer, the peer can use the IP address of 10.0.0.2 only. That's what /32 means. It means just this specific address. And this value needs to be unique per peer that we generate. And it has to be within the subnet here. So if you're not familiar with this notation, the /24, it really means this, 10.0.0.1 through 10.0.0.255. So any IP within this range. Now the 1 is reserved for this interface, so we can't use that. So that's why we used 2 here. Now if I were to make another peer down below here, and I have allowed IPs, this has to be a new value. So I cannot use 2 again, and I cannot use 1 because it's used by the interface. So this has to be 3 or 4 or 5, but I usually increment them by 1 each time, and it could be any value that's within the subnet. So that's just one thing that you need to be aware of whenever you're setting up your peers. So now that we have some of those values set, we're going to press Control X, Y, and then Enter. So I'm actually going to also print out my private key and get that set up. So we're going to do sudo cat, and cat is just print the top of the file to the screen. Etsy, Wireguard, and private key. And we're just going to highlight this value, copy, go back in here, and paste this in as is. So we're going to have to make another update to the WG0 config, but first we need to verify one thing on the server, and I recommend you do this as well. So if you type IP root list default, what this is going to do is it's going to print this command to this output to the screen. So this is saying the default root, meaning this server gets to the internet through a gateway, and the gateway is defined as the default, and it says via, meaning we're taking that route across, and then it gives you an IP address. So in my case, because this is on the 192.168.0.1 subnet, it says, okay, the main server that's sending my traffic out is 192.168.0.1. Now the value we're looking for is this right here. This is going to be your interface specification, the name of the interface. So you may see ETH0 or WLAN0 or INET or something along those lines. Usually it's going to be one of these 2 values here. because this is running on a VM, I have this ENP0S3. So I'm going to copy this value and save it somewhere, because we need to copy a whole bunch of commands really quick back to this Wireguard wg0.config. So I'm going to open this back up. I'm going to come down in the interface section, but above the peer. I'm going to paste a few commands in here. Now these commands are going to be available in the slides that are linked below, and they're also on my GitHub. But I'll walk through what each thing does. So first I'm going to convert all of these ETH zeros to that interface that I have, and then we'll come back and walk through those commands. Okay, so I've made my config changes, and now we can go and discuss what we got here. So first thing we're going to do is, you can see we have post up and pre-down rules. So the way we're going to be setting up the Wireguard configuration is we're going to allow it to be brought up quickly and torn down quickly, but it'll also be set up to start automatically on server boot. So after it's been created, we're going to want to create a couple rules here. So after the interface has been created, so post up, meaning as soon as it's been created, we're going to create a new firewall rule. So we're using UFW, which is the uncomplicated firewall. We're going to create a root, and we're going to allow in on the Wireguard port, which is WG0, and we're going to then allow it to travel back out. And because I used my default route is running across this interface, we're also going to allow all traffic out on that interface as long as it comes from WG0. Then the next thing we're going to do is using IP tables. We're going to set a NAT rule, and it's going to say after it's post routed, meaning that this gets sent to this interface, we're going to masquerade the IP. So Wireguard is using this subnet 10.0.0.1/24, but this ENPOS3 interface is using 192.168.0.1/24. Specifically, the IP of the server is 192.168.0.74. So what this rule does is it changes the IP addresses leaving this interface coming from Wireguard to be the correct one. So just to show that a little bit better. So if my peer 1, we'll say peer 1 here, has this IP of 10.0.0.2, and this is on WG0, it routes to the ENPOS3, which is really your etho. But this becomes 192.168.0.74, which is the IP of my server. So this gets sent to this address, and it gets sent on the output is here. So it kind of hides your traffic in a way as it leaves the server address. And then we repeat that. So IP tables is IPv4, IP6 tables is IPv6, and then pre-down basically undoes everything we just did. So here we have the delete rule, and we have the delete as well. So once you have that all set up, you can then save this file, Control X and Y to exit, and we should be back onto the main screen. So now that we've made our changes to the WG0 conf, we're also going to need to print out one thing to the screen. We're going to have to get our public key. So copy this value, and then you're going to have to send this value over to your Android device. So when you set up your connection configuration, you're going to have to take this key and paste it in there for the peer. So I'll be switching over to the Android device, and I'll be walking you through how to do that. So here we are on the Wireguard application inside of Android. So below you'll see this blank screen. We're going to hit this plus button here, and we're going to hit create from scratch. So now you should see this new page, and we're going to have interface, and we're going to put a name here. So in my case, we're going to put Ubuntu. And this can be anything you want. This does not really matter. Now the next section, you'll see private key, public key, and then you'll see this refresh icon over here on the right. So we're going to click this, and this will generate all of our public and private keys for this peer. So for now, we're going to leave that be. Then we're going to go down to addresses, and we're going to type 10.0.0.2/32. So if you recall, previously we set up this peer and we created this in the conf. So the IPs of the Wireguard tunnel are on 10.0.0.1/24, And then we had our peer section, and the peer section was 10.0.0.2 for the specific peer. So we're going to use that same address that we noted in that WG0 config here. Then we're going to go down to add peer right here. And now you should see this new section. Now this public key here is going to be the public key that we pasted on the screen from before from the server. So when we did the cat command and did public key, that's what's going to go here. I'm not going to paste it because you're not going to be able to actually see what happens. Wireguard actually blacks out as a privacy thing. So we're going to leave that blank. I will do that off screen. Then endpoint here, we're going to do 192.168.0.75. My screen's going to lag a little bit, but 75 here. So this is going to be the public IP address of your server. If you are on a VPS, you can check your GUI to see what the public IP is going to be. Otherwise, in most cases, if you are in the console, you could type IPA or ifconfig, and it'll show you the public IP. So all you want to do is put that value here. Then we're going to do :51820. And what that is that's the default port that Wireguard is set up to use. So if you remember the WG0.conf, we put 51820 as the port. Also in all our firewall rules, we put 51820. If you change that value, you need to change this here. And then the last section here is under allowed IPs. We're going to do 0.0.0.0/0. And that means all IPv4 addresses. And we're going to do comma, ::/0. So my screen is lagging here. ::/0. And that means any IPv6 address. So this creates a full tunnel, and it allows us to have a full encryption tunnel into our VPS. If we wanted to change this to only allow specific IPs, we would then modify these allowed IPs. But for our example here, we're just going to keep everything as every IP counts. Then we're going to come up here and we're going to copy this public key. This needs to go in the peer section on the WG0conf. So we're going to switch back over to that, and we're going to show you how to go and do that. And that'll be on the server. I'm also going to be pasting the public key from the server here, but I will be doing that off screen since you will not be able to see what I'm doing once I do that. So now we're back on the terminal, and I just received the public key from my peer. So I'm going to go back to my Wireguard config. So sudo nano etc wireguard wg0.config. So in here, we're going to go down to the peer, and the public key that we generated on the peer, we are going to just paste right here. Control X and yes. And that should be the last thing we have to do for this specific configuration. I do want to point out this top part, you do not have to touch if you ever want to add a new peer. All you need to do is type peer here, and you're just going to be adding the public key for your second peer, as well as the allowed IPs here. So in our new example, we could have a different public key, so we'll just random values here. And then this new address would be 10.0.0.3/32. So that's how you would add a new peer. But in our example, we're only using one peer for now. So now we have to just set up a few more firewall rules really quick, and then we can enable the service. So we're going to do sudo UFW. We're going to be using the uncomplicated firewall for this. Allow. And we're going to allow access in on 51820, which is the port that we specified for Wireguard. And it uses the UDP protocol. So it's going to update the rules for IPv4 and IPv6. We're also going to allow OpenSSH connections, which is how we're able to connect to the server right now. If you don't do this, you will lose access to your server and you will not be able to get back in. So please make sure you do this step. By default, UFW block denies all unless specified. And then the last step is to enable. So this will turn on the firewall and start it on boot. So we're going to hit yes to disrupt connections. And now firewall is active. So now if you type sudo UFW status, you should see all the rules that we just specified. So 51.820 UDP, allow from anywhere, OpenSSH, allow from anywhere. So you can also change these configs so that you can allow OpenSSH only over the WG0 port, which is going to be over the 51820 through Wireguard, that interface, but that's outside the scope of this video. So now that we have those set up, we're going to actually enable the Wireguard service. So we're going to do sudo system control enable wg-quick at wg0.service. So this just created the symlink that we see here, and what this will do is it'll allow Wireguard to start at system boot. And then we're gonna just start the service by just changing the enable to start. And if you don't see any more printed to the console, that means everything started successfully. So we're gonna go here and check the status by changing a start to a status. And as you see here, we are loaded. It is active and it is green. And you can see all these rules were added here. So this just actually took our values from our WG0 config. And now if we actually check our firewall, you should see we also have new values. So now we're allowing forwarding from WG0 to this. So now we can clear this out. And let's switch back over to the Android device and see if we have a connection to the server. So now we're back at the Wireguard configuration on the Android device. So if we click the toggle button right over here, we should see our connection turn on, and we should now see RX and TX. So if the RX is 0 here, that means you're not receiving anything back from the server. So a couple things you need to make sure you have set up correctly is the keys. Make sure the public key for both the peer and the server are correct, as well as these endpoint IPs. So that's correct. If that's all good, then you should start seeing some values coming back. You can also look in the /var/ufw log to see if it's blocking connections. Usually that'll happen if the keys are incorrect, but some diagnosis you'll have to do. But for the most part, if you follow this step by step, this should give you a working connection. So I'm going to turn this off and turn it back on just to verify once again, and it looks like we still have connection. So that's how we set up a Wireguard connection to an Ubuntu server. This is going to be coming from the VPS slides on my GitHub.